Good afternoon, everyone. All right. Welcome to the session, Every Time the Media Lies. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling incredibly inspired after this morning's session. The amazing speakers rightly reaffirmed that the Palestinian resistance to the Zionist project is winning. It's winning on many fronts. And specifically here today, we're going to talk about the battle of ideas. While the terror and depravity of the Zionist entity is not novel, the visibility of its acts very much is. There are many factors which have driven millions of people across the world into the streets and into the struggle, but the real-time live coverage of the genocide has shaken people to their core and unmasked the true nature of Zionism and imperialism. In fact, Israel is so terrified about the truth coming out that it has assassinated 144 journalists in Gaza and has barred media and journalists from even entering. Shame. But in these last 8 months, we have also witnessed the unmasking of corporate media, which has been backed into a corner as it attempts to justify Israel's actions while still maintaining the fallacy of neutrality, which we know to be code word for stenographers of the State Department. This overly biased reporting by news outlets like the New York Times has created a deep crisis of legitimacy, as millions of people are turning their backs on these papers of record and turning to media that actually tells the truth and is not afraid to take a side. It is my honor to be joined by journalists who have done just that for the past 8 months and long before that. We have Yumna Patel of Moderator, Mnar Adely of Mint Press News, Layla of Writers Against the War in Gaza, and Eugene Puryear of Breakthrough News. I want to get the session started with Yumna, who is the Palestine News Director for Moderator. Yumna, since Moderator was founded in 2006, it has sought to break through the propaganda around Palestine and inform its largely US audience about the reality on the ground. You were in Palestine for the month of October and have lived there for several years. Beyond covering Israel's genocidal violence against the Palestinian people, what kind of stories have you sought to tell? How do you cover resistance and the resilience of the Palestinian people?
Thanks, Zoe. Thank you, everyone, for being here. There's a lot that I can say about this topic, specifically resilience and resistance of the Palestinian people. I'll start by talking a little bit about my own experience reporting and living in Palestine, and then I'd like to draw attention to the work that Moderator and other outlets have been doing on this issue, as Zoe mentioned, not just for the past 8 months, but for years and decades before that as well. So for myself personally, I moved to Palestine in 2016, where I was working for a local Palestinian news agency. And there, day to day, we were reporting on essentially the same stories that were coming across our desk. Teenagers were being killed in raids. The Israeli Navy was opening fire on Gaza fishermen off the coast. People were being arrested from their homes in the middle of the night. I mean, these were the stories that we could essentially count on day to day, day in and day out, even on slow news days. As I started to go out into the field and started reporting actually and speaking to people outside of my desk and interviewing the families of martyrs, I would ask people, what is your message? Not only to people around the world or people who may be reading these stories, but also if they had a message to send directly to the Israeli occupation or to the people who had put them in this situation. And every single time, without fail, people had messages that they wanted to send. if it was a message to the international community, it was often one of frustration, of feeling like for decades and for years, their stories and their pleas were falling on deaf ears. But whenever people would send their messages, whenever they would talk to me about what they would want to say to the Israeli occupation, and again, these are in a lot of situations we're speaking directly to the mothers or fathers who have just lost their sons, whose sons were killed. We've spoken to people literally as they're sitting on top the rubble of their homes that were just demolished. So in these incredibly tragic situations that I think is very difficult for most of us to kind of even comprehend or fathom the type of pain that people are experiencing in that moment, without fail, in every single story that I worked on, that I was reporting on, people would essentially tell me the same thing. They would say, no matter what it is, they can come and they can kill us. They can come and they can destroy our homes. They can come and kick us out of our villages. They can throw us in jail. It doesn't matter. We are not going to leave. We are going to be here, and we are not moving. And so early on in my years, I'm not Palestinian. I went to Palestine to be a journalist. And so very quickly, I started to come to terms with these concepts or this theme of resilience or sumud or steadfastness within the Palestinian culture. And it started naturally to become a feature of all of my reporting. And I know of the reporting of many of my colleagues. Of course, there were only a few outlets where we could really report about these kinds of things. I could count them on one hand. One of them at the time was Mondoise. But these concepts, these themes of resilience kept presenting themselves with every single story. No matter who I spoke to, young, old, it didn't matter the community. This was something that people talked about all the time. And so in my attempts as a journalist in sort of my early years, I wanted to be able to humanize people, right? There's this thinking that, okay, if you can humanize people, if you can tell their stories beyond just the statistics or beyond just, the numbers of martyrs for that year, then maybe you can appeal to people. Maybe you can appeal to audiences if you appeal to their humanity. And when you're talking about resilience and this idea that it doesn't matter what happens to us, we're not going to leave, I think it can be really easy for people on the outside or foreigners like myself to kind of almost romanticize this concept of resilience, right? Like, wow, these are people who have undergone incredible suffering and incredible unimaginable pain, and yet they are insistent on their rights to stay, to remain where they are, and their rights to live, with dignity. So it's easy to kind of romanticize that. But what I started to also realize, and when you realize this, when you live with people, when you're talking to them every day, is coupled with those, themes of resilience and hope, is also the natural emotions of frustration and anger and sadness and immense grief, and a desire to do something more than just be victimized or be portrayed as a victim. So then the challenge arises as a journalist is, how do you then do justice to people's stories? Because the easiest way to humanize Palestinians is in a way that's palatable to the mainstream media or to media outlets that are even willing to publish their stories, is by, humanizing them, but maintaining them in this box of victimhood. So there's this challenge of how do we break out of that? Because in my experience, all the people that I would speak to, no matter if it was, the family of a prisoner on hunger strike, or again, someone whose home was just demolished, no one I ever spoke to, despite the situation that they were in, despite the incredible oppression that they were facing, they would never just refer to themselves or portray themselves as a victim. That wasn't the wholeness or entirety of their identity or of their story. When people spoke about resilience, there's a reason that they were able to be resilient, and it was through resistance and through their ability to resist for decades in whatever way they chose. And so it became important for me, at least personally, when, I'm reporting on a story about a young boy, for example, that was killed in clashes, right, as it would be reported in the media. It's important to, tell this boy's story, tell the story of his family, but also it's important to recognize, if the family is willing to talk about it, the fact that this boy maybe was throwing stones. And it's important to recognize that. Why? Because that is the only method of resistance that he could cling onto or that he could find, and a method of resistance that he chose to pursue, based on his life and his life experiences, because he felt that in that moment, that is what he could do, that is the only thing that he could do to break out of this constant cycle of oppression. And so there are challenges when you want to almost normalize resistance, right? You want to be able to normalize this concept that, yes, people stand up against their oppression. People aren't just victims. There are challenges on the ground. Naturally, families, when you're speaking to families in Palestine, they may not want to share if their sons were throwing stones for many reasons. First, they know that it will be used against them, or it will be used against their son. If their son was not killed, it will be used as a way by the Israeli occupation to criminalize them. If they were killed, it will be used as a means by the occupation and also by the media to justify their killing, right? So you have to respect those boundaries. But also from the perspective of an audience, you'd be surprised how many times you see people jumping in the comments after just reading a story about a family who lost their 15-year-old son because he was shot while throwing stones. It's incredible, or while lighting fire to a Molotov cocktail. It's incredible how many times you'd see people come into the comments, people who might even be sympathetic, right, with the cause, and say, well, why were they doing that? Why were they throwing stones? Why were they, throwing Molotov cocktails? What did they expect to happen? And so there are all these challenges that you encounter when trying to normalize this concept of resistance in reporting. But it's important to do it. And so in the past couple years, what my colleagues and I at Mondoweiss have done is, in the West Bank at least, over the past few years, we recognize this trend of a resurgence of armed resistance in the West Bank. First, it started with reports of armed clashes that were happening in places where that usually doesn't happen. Then there were reports of these targeted assassinations and ambushes from the Israeli military on groups of young men. And then it was, out in the open every day, there were new reports of new armed militias or brigades or resistance groups being formed in Jenin and Tulkarem and Nablus and all of these places. And so we saw this happening, and every day on the ground, you could feel it. Things were changing. There was something happening. But when you looked at what was happening in the media, you didn't really see any of it, outside maybe of how Israeli media was reporting on it from the framework of the Israeli military, right? That the military is undergoing this operation, this extended operation to quash, armed terror groups in the West Bank. So because we had reporters on the ground, because we had this infrastructure that we'd put in place with Mondoweiss, that's been around for decades, reporting on Palestinian stories, we were able to go into those communities and speak to the people who were not just the communities that were being affected, but also the communities where these young resistance fighters were coming from. And we were also able to speak to the fighters themselves and get to the bottom of it from their perspective. Why are you taking up arms? Why are you resisting? Why are you choosing this path? And it was an incredible thing to witness after, we were publishing our coverage in January 2023 on the heels of an expansive Israeli military raid in the Jenin refugee camp, which at that time was the deadliest and largest raid on the camp since the Second Intifada. Of course, since then, there's been much larger, much deadlier raids. We went in with our video team and we started interviewing people. We interviewed people whose homes were totally blown up by the military. We interviewed the families of martyrs, and we also spoke to these young resistance fighters themselves. And we spoke to them, not just about, okay, why are you taking up arms? But we spoke to them about their lives, about everything that they'd witnessed from their childhood, their frustrations with their own government, with their own leaders, their frustrations with political corruption, with the lack of any, political horizons, and all the things that led them up to this point, but also all the things that continue to make them human. And after we published that video and so many other reports where we were in these communities talking to these people, it was incredible to see the reaction to it from both sides. We had the reactions from within the community themselves, people reaching out to us, saying that, first, we're shocked that people, even English language speaking media, wanted to come and speak to us beyond just, filming us from the outside and referring to us as these, masked terror groups or whatever it is. People actually came and spoke to us and wanted to hear our stories and then told it in a truthful way. But on the outside, people were also, shocked and refreshed to see that that narrative was being shared. And so I think it's incredibly important now in this moment and over the past 8 months to continue to do justice to people's stories in their entirety and to continue to normalize not just the concept of resilience, but also of resistance as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yumna. The stories that you all have told of this resistance is so crucial. And even though there are all these challenges that you mentioned, it's so important that we continue to tell these stories and take on these challenges. Our next speaker is Mnar Adely, an award-winning journalist and editor who's the founder and director of Mint Press News. Mnar, your outlet, Mint Press, has been one of the many important voices in covering not only the genocide, but Palestinian resistance and the solidarity movement. And for this crime, it has been subjected to heavy censorship. In what ways have we seen authorities and tech companies try to crack down on pro-Palestine media like Mint Press since October 7th? And is this a new trend that we're seeing, and what's behind this increase?
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here. The fact that we are all here today shows that this is what resistance and dissent looks like right here in the heart of empire. They thought they could bury us, but we turned out to be seeds. For the last decade, Mint Press has been sounding the alarm about a censorship campaign led by the ruling military class. And we have seen this crackdown expand much harder than it ever has since October 7th. And it is being led by some of the most notorious think tanks, lobby groups, and military intelligence agencies that have partnered up with big tech, Silicon Valley, to control the free flow of information. They are working together around the clock to push atrocity propaganda, to flag our news as fake news, and to push lie after lie after lie to promote their war machine. When I started Mint Press over a decade ago, I was a survivor of apartheid. I had lived under Israeli occupation and apartheid as a preteen with a vision to show the world the true realities of living under war. Because our media here in the United States is not even a mainstream media anymore. We have an extremist corporate media beating the drums of war. And since starting Mint Press, one of the main things that we have reported on is this very interconnected web of intelligence agencies and people and military personnel, including within the Israeli military, that are working within big tech to control the free flow of information. Since the election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, that was one of the main first places where we saw this connection being made. we saw big tech giants like Facebook and Google partner up with NATO-funded think tanks like the Atlantic Council, a think tank that is funded by Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and by the State of Israel itself. And this think tank has infiltrated and worked with these big tech giants to crack down on the free flow of information under the guise of fighting fake news and Russian propaganda and Iranian bots online. But what we saw soon after this partnership was a major crackdown on independent media and anti-war voices. And we have to remember that with the rise of the internet and these social media tech giants during the Arab Spring, Facebook, Twitter, all of the platforms were celebrated as a means of spreading information, of promoting democracy and free speech and our First Amendment. And so people around the world flocked to these platforms to share their ideas. But what these platforms have done is weaponized human rights. They've weaponized our First Amendment. They've weaponized democracy to control the free flow of information. Soon after the elections, during the 2016 election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, we saw organizations like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, partner up with YouTube and Google to flag controversial content. Now, the Anti-Defamation League is one of the most anti-free speech and anti-democracy organizations in this country. It is a racist organization that needs to be called out for what it is, which is an Israeli intelligence asset. The Anti-Defamation League has notoriously and historically spied on pro-Palestine activists since the 1960s and anti-South African apartheid activists since then. The Anti-Defamation League was called on by the FBI in the 1960s to be registered as a foreign agent because it was discovered that they were collecting information on pro-Palestine groups and anti-South African apartheid activists in the United States and sending that information to Israel's Mossad intelligence agency. And yet, right now, the Anti-Defamation League is leading an anti-free speech campaign in this country. And they are working directly with the FBI and with big tech giants to flag independent media coverage of what's happening in Gaza because they want to normalize genocide. But we will never normalize genocide ever, ever again. And so through our investigations at Mint Press, we have been able to expose not just the ADL and these weapons manufacturers, but the fact that Israeli military unit 8200, a notorious elite Israeli intelligence unit within the IDF, hundreds of these people have infiltrated and are now working within Microsoft, within Facebook, within Google, within big tech giants to monitor millions of people's video chats, their calls, their messages, and their posts. Where do you think that information is going? Probably to a foreign government, an apartheid state. How is this okay? Another thing that we have done at Mint Press is also look at the hundreds of individuals within the US State Department and the CIA who are in very important high places within TikTok. You see, the last year, TikTok has been sold to us as a Chinese Trojan horse. But that is just one big lie. TikTok is currently run by many State Department and CIA officials who are cracking down on what can be seen and heard and read within that platform. And we at Mint Press, after we published this investigation, we just so happened to get banned from TikTok and haven't been able to get our page back up. PayPal, notoriously working with the Department of Homeland Security, has also banned us from their platform. They banned Mint Press, they banned myself, they banned our lead investigative journalist, Alan McLeod, for our investigations on the war in Ukraine, looking at some of the so-called independent outlets like the Kiev Independent, which are funded by Western governments. On Indiegogo, we've had our fundraisers taken down as well and our funds seized for our investigations, looking at this inner working between the national security state, the Israeli military, and these big tech platforms. But as we see and feel the walls caving in on us, and we have our reach suppressed, Mint Press has been a target of Google Owl Project, which took us from the #1 ranking independent media outlet in a news search on Google News to now on page perhaps 3 or 4. That was from Project Google Owl. Despite the walls caving in, what does this actually tell us? It actually tells us that we are winning the information war. The descent and this tide of awakening that has taken over our streets, that has awakened our consciousness, we are their biggest enemy. And they are cracking down like no other because they know that we are winning. Today, the neoliberal class has lifted the veil of their moral depravity in supporting not just what's happening in Gaza, because what's happening in Gaza is a horrific tragedy, but it's just an outward expression of what US imperialism represents. For over a decade, we have been covering US wars, and we have been exposing the way in which they are cracking down on the information. And they will continue to do so until we rise up to the occasion, to the hour, and support independent media like the ones that we have representing here today, like Mint Press, like Breakthrough News, like Mondowise. This is a David versus Goliath war of information. We cannot claim to be living in a democracy when the very powers that be control all of the information that we access. And so I really appreciate everybody being here today, and I hope that you will continue to stand behind independent media, because this is a David versus Goliath war that we can win as long as we keep our voices loud and we show up on the streets to be heard and seen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mnar. A good reminder to everyone to get out your phones, follow Mint Press, follow Mondowise, follow Breakthrough News, follow WAWOG, follow People's Dispatch, my own outlet, because it's our media projects who are telling your stories and the stories of the people of the world. Now we're going to hear from Layla Bazi, who is an investigative journalist and an organizer with PYM and Writers Against the War in Gaza. Yes, give it up. Layla, Writers Against the War in Gaza has been essential in denouncing the complicity of mainstream corporate media like the New York Times in manufacturing consent for genocide with protests, the open letter, the new publication, New York War Crimes. Tell us about this process of organizing and why this intervention is so necessary.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much to our previous two speakers. So inspiring. So I just, first for the unfamiliar, I want to give a little bit of background on what Writers Against the War on Gaza is. So we're a pretty new organization. We were actually founded after October 7th and inspired by a similar formation during the Vietnam War years. We're a writers group, but more accurately, we're a group of culture workers, so editors, videographers, photographers, and what we're basically doing is we're building scaffolding for a cultural front for Palestine in the imperial core. And we see the pen and the image as weapons to combat, in this, I loved how you put it, Mnar, like this information war, you know, against these mainstream institutions whose words, as Shuru al-Assad told us in an interview, are as dangerous as bullets. So we engage in a multiplicity of tactics, and we think this is very important. We work on PACB, which is the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, and we have a committee that's dedicated to this work. And we basically do this because we're culture workers, so we reach out to our networks, to our colleagues, to our former colleagues, the places that we know, and we organize them. And we've actually been quite successful. So since October 7th, we've worked with more than 100 different organizations around the world that have decided to sign on to PACB. So next time you feel like reading The New Yorker, go to our website, go to the PACB tab, and read one of those organizations' work instead. So we also participate in and promote direct actions that address U.S. cultural institutions' complicity with Zionism. So this is like art galleries, like the New Gallery, which in New York, which is literally directly funded by the IOF and enjoys money from Elbit Systems. This is museums, of course, like the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney, and of course, the imperial tabloid, the New York Times, you know, whose lobby we recently occupied and whose press we blockaded for a morning. We also work on campaigns that call out the contradictions of cultural institutions. The one that immediately comes to mind is the PEN America campaign. So for those of you unfamiliar with PEN America, it's a very interesting organization. You know, they claim to, you know, promote free speech in the literary world. And they're like against book bans and these sorts of things. They've also successfully repressed every single member of their ranks that's tried to push for PACB since October 7th. And so we made their lives very difficult after their CEO, Suzanne Nosel, took a trip to the occupied lands to celebrate the launch of PEN Israel. And we basically organized their workforce and their awardees, and as of now, almost every single awardee this year has pulled out of the competition. And these are not... These are not small awards. The largest award is like $75,000. These are career-changing awards. And so, you know, this is important because it sends a message to the cultural institutions of this country that if you're, you know, you better think twice before trying to, you know, get in the way of people trying to fight for Palestinian liberation in the cultural front. Very quickly, we also do political education. This is very important as well, to normalize armed struggle. And this often looks like putting on a film screening with a panel discussion afterwards, or publishing writings by or about revolutionaries like Sohab Shara or Bassel al-A'raj. And finally, we really try to support the broader movement in whichever way we can and take cues from the organizations and the people who've been doing this for far longer than we have. So recently, we were at the encampments. And what we were doing there, we were kind of lending our support through media trainings initially. But then, you know, because of all those connections that we made in those spaces, we ended up becoming somewhat of organizers in those spaces, connecting students from different campuses with each other so that they could share tactical knowledge and media skills and these sorts of things. So now I'm going to actually answer your question. So the intervention that we're perhaps best known for is the New York War Crimes, which is two things. Yeah. It is, on the one hand, a piece of propaganda meant to protest the New York Times, and it is also becoming more of a movement outlet, a place where we publish the voices that we want to hear from, translations, poems from people actually in Gaza right now. And so we have our newspaper, the New York War Crimes, and we've also launched a website which basically includes a systemic critique of the New York Times through the ages. So that's not only their coverage of Palestine, but just their historic complicity with U.S. empire. So, their coverage of Vietnam, of Guatemala, of Iran. So I want to first address this question, like, why the New York Times? There's a lot of people who have failed or organizations that have failed abysmally in their coverage of the genocide. The New York Times is what we call the paper of record in the US and in the wider Western world, right? It is singular in its power and in its function. It's cited by Israelis and Americans all the time to justify horrific war crimes. And what is so insidious about the Times is that they operate under this banner of independence and journalistic integrity and the pursuit of truth. And people believe it, right? So, like, I don't know, you're probably not going to hear someone say, well, I saw it on Fox News, so, like, it has to be true. But you're actually going to maybe think twice before completely dismissing something that's in the New York Times. And as a result, they get away with crazy things. So, like, obviously, we all know their headlines. Their headlines are famous. I picked my favorite one from 2014. Missile at beachside Gaza cafe finds patrons poised for World Cup. Like, the missile, it's just flying through the air. It's just looking for someone who's, like, watching the World Cup. It's just, and this goes against everything you'll ever learn in a journalism school. The failure to assign blame, the passive tense, the failure to name a victim. But they get away with it because they're the New York Times. We talk about the New York Times as state media that is manufacturing consent for genocide. And we target the New York Times for the same reason that you target the State Department. Not because they are a site of legitimacy that we actually think we can reform for the better, but because we see them as an engine of mass death. So I want to quickly talk about the New York war crimes and the kind of visual image of the New York war crimes. If you see it from far away, you might actually think that it is the New York Times, just because of the way it looks. And this is on purpose. So, like, we use their font and we use their layout. So why do we do this? The reason we do this is we're actually weaponizing the image of the New York Times, which is so often associated with a voice of authority. So what we're really doing here is we're stealing their authority. And we're making you look twice. And there's kind of a long tradition in leftist propaganda of the double take. This idea that if you look twice, the second time, you see it differently. And so we do this, I love this, like, fun thing that we do, which is, like, in the, they had these little box at the top of their newspaper, all the news that's fit to print we change it to all the consent that's fit to manufacture. So I want to just end by explaining the New York war crimes as really like an alternative. Many of us hold this belief that we must organize where we work. What better place is there to organize than the institutions that we know best, the colleagues we know best, the places we know how they operate? And for the longest time, us culture workers in the heart of empire, we've just been reduced to being parts of these big institutions, not having a say in what they write, not having a say in how they're funded. But that's changing. There's been a real shift. A lot of these places are unionizing. They're in the process of becoming unions, and people are feeling more empowered to speak up, especially since October 7th. So, when we say that we want to make writing for the New York Times embarrassing, we're saying that we're not just cogs in their machine, like where the end-all, be-all goal of being in the media industry, in this country is to work for the New York Times. No. And we're not just stopping at not ever writing for the Times or kind of like putting our foot down there. We're actually going to make an alternative to the New York Times. We're going to call it the New York War Crimes. and we're going to do what they don't do, which is we're going to print what they won't print, Palestinian voices. Palestinian voices. We did a data analysis of all the coverage of the New York Times since October 7th, and we found that they quote Israeli and American sources more than 3 times as much as Palestinian ones. Why? Like, we operate on a tiny, tiny budget. We all do this work on top of our full-time jobs, and we're able to create a paper full of these voices. And so I'll just end by saying, just plugging our final campaign, which is our unsubscribe campaign. If anyone here is still subscribed to the New York Times, please unsubscribe, and instead pick up an issue of the New York War Crimes at the WOWOG table.
Thank you so much, Layla. Definitely check out the New York War Crimes, incredible publication. Finally, we're going to hear from Eugene Puryear. He's a host at Breakthrough News, journalist, organizer, and the author of Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America. Yeah. Eugene, as the movement on the streets for Palestine has grown to historic levels, we've seen selective silence from the mainstream media. Breakthrough News, along with other people's media outlets, has been on the ground for the past 8 months in the streets, on campuses, trying to not only provide thoughtful analysis on the situation in Palestine, but also on the growing movement here. What is driving so many sectors of society to take action? What is the role of grassroots media outlets like Breakthrough in this moment of an upsurge of mobilization?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for the question, and thanks everyone for attending here today, and everyone who has worked to put on this conference and made it possible to be here. It's really an honor to be alongside such distinguished colleagues and in front of all of you who've been doing so much important work. I think there's so many things we could say about, what the importance of the role of alternative media, but, I want to just briefly reference back to something that our brother Raja Abdul Haq said about the importance of solidarity across the global South and those of us in the global North struggling against imperialism, because I also greet you here on May 25th on African Liberation Day, and I say to all those celebrating around the world, Happy African Liberation Day. And in the context of understanding what's happening, I think one of the elements that has been whitewashed in many ways is the strength of the Palestinian solidarity movement on the African continent. I mean, of course, I think all of us here have seen South Africa, the tremendous moral clarity, the massive mobilizations, 250,000 people in Cape Town, the challenge at the International Court of Justice. I think some of us may have seen the moral clarity of Namibia to take on Germany and to challenge them as having no right to speak about genocide, having genocided the Nama and Herero people and refused to apologize for it. We've seen the statements of solidarity from governments like Algeria, Eritrea, also Western Sahara, that has always been stalwart with the Palestinian people as they continue to fight against colonialization. The millions of people who we've seen in Morocco day in and day out struggle against the king's normalization regime. In Egypt, where unfortunately there are many obstacles to protesting, but I'll have you know, one of the strongest boycott movements happening anywhere in the world against not just, Israeli goods, American goods, European goods, where millions of Egyptians are voting with their pocketbooks in extremely dire circumstances in order to make sure that they are also raising their voices against the genocide and ethnic cleansing. In Somalia, where we saw thousands of young people take to the streets in a northern village in solidarity with the young people of Gaza who are being killed. Thousands of people who have gone to the streets in Accra, Ghana. Also in Nigeria, which I want to give special recognition to, because this year on Al-Quds Day, we lost 4 martyrs in Nigeria who were shot down by the police just for standing up in solidarity with Palestine, and they have not stopped. Sudan, And many of us are looking at the tragedy of Sudan, and I think it's critically important for all of us to know that one of the main reasons why U.S. imperialism, along with the EU, has done everything possible to prevent the mass movement of millions of Sudan from taking power and refounding their country is because they are 100% opposed to the normalization of Sudan with Israel. They want to end it now, and they're expressing solidarity all the time. I had the opportunity a couple months ago to talk to a comrade in Undermine who sent me a message to congratulate us on our coverage of Palestine on Breakthrough News. This is one of the most affected areas in the war. And I said, wow, thank you so much. I can't believe that you would do this. I hope everything's good for you. And he said, Sudan, Palestine, USA, same struggle, same fight against imperialism. Keep up the good work. And finally, I'll just add on that note about what's happening in Africa and Senegal, where after 3 years of huge mass protest against the neo-colonial pro-French regime, we've had a new government come to power. You've heard a lot about it, and the mainstream media is like, oh, it's so great, elections, democracy. But what wasn't reported in the New York Times or all these other places who said it was so great was the Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko, who said just about a week and a half ago at a press conference that we, the people of Senegal who have waged this struggle, that we, and I quote, stand with Palestine until liberation. So to segue into your actual question, I also had a little preface there. The importance of alternative media. I mean, there is an African proverb that says, until the lion tells the story, the hunter will always be the hero. And I think that's really our first piece here, is to tell our own stories, because we can't rely on the enemy to tell our stories. There may be a decent article here, you may get a good quote here, but let's just be 100% clear. The mainstream media, quote unquote, are agents of the imperialist bourgeoisie. They are agents of the ruling class designed to create a narrative that will confuse you about what's really going on in the world. I mean, you just think about, say, CNN, for instance. The chairman of the board of CNN has been a top executive at PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is one of these business consultancies that tells companies how to destroy the world. He's also been an executive at Citigroup. Now he's the board chair of CNN. Why would you expect an institution that was led by Wall Street bankers, big corporate heads, and the inherited money of people like A.O. Solzberg at the New York Times to actually tell our stories directly? They're not just random actors. They are actual parts of the ruling institutions that exist. So we have to have alternative media, and we shouldn't really call it alternative media. Let's call it people's media that can tell the story of the popular classes around the world. And I think for the purposes of the conference here today, one other critically important element of this, and I think that all of us have been able to do at our own outlets and our own work, is to humanize the movement to some degree. I think people are often moved to limited actions, one-time donation, going to a demonstration once or twice, by the moral depravity that they see around them. I think people become involved in a sustained way in movements and organizations because they can see themselves in those movements and organizations. In two types of ways, I think. I mean, one in the most sort of narrow sense, right? They can see themselves in the context of the diversity of the movement. And, I don't have to say that much about that. I mean, just look around. Look who's here. Look who's at this event. I think however you want to define the word diversity, that is this global movement that has arisen in solidarity with Palestine. So when you can show that day in and day out on the ground, who's at the protest, who's at the encampments, who are the organizers, that helps people who are starting to become interested, who want to take action, to say, perhaps I have a place there too, because I can see people like me have a place there, and thus they want to take that extra step to truly become organized. And I think that is critically important to our media work. But not just sort of the diversity of the movement as people, but the unity of us in the movement and thought. That they're not just people who look like you, who have similar experiences and backgrounds like you, but also people who think like you. And that despite all of those differences, you have this profound unity around the struggles and the causes and the things that you're united around. So to have what I view as a privilege every week, to have organizers on to discuss their deeper understanding of the events that are taking place, to be able to open open up the door to real conversations about what is, not just the right to resist, but the historical context and connection of it from the Palestinian people to peoples around the world, which is not just a vindication of the Palestinian resistance, but it's also a vindication of the historical experience of oppressed people. I mean, it's not an accident that we draw links between Algeria and Haiti and Palestine on a regular basis with people who join Breakthrough News. It's because all of those are just struggles against oppressors that we have something to learn from, and the desire to wipe away that justness is a major part of what's going on. So validating people in these core feelings that they have, giving them a sense of who they are. I mean, anybody who's doing anything for Palestine, you know about the Palestinian youth movement. But who are they and what do they really think? And the opportunity to be able to have them explicate that and to explain and to teach. I think those are the things that also open a door to the movement, because it helps you, again, humanize who is really involved, what's really going on, and again, to see yourself there and to know that you have a place and you have a role. And I think that's maybe a lesser part of people's media when we think about the importance of it in the context of the battle of ideas. But perhaps maybe one of the most important parts of it is that it's an entryway for people to become more involved and to get more deeply engaged. And, finally, I want to say, and in reference to what Comrade Yara shared with us in the opening yesterday, I mean, the importance of building organizations. I think building people's media is a major part of building popular institutions. Listen, anyone you follow us, we're always asking you for money, but that's why we're asking you for your money, because this is who we want to be accountable to. This is the form of accountability and the barometer for our own success that we want to have. To say that the people whose work is moving change, changing the world, are also willing to kick in the $1, the $2, the $5, the $10. That's what lets us know that we're on the right track and that we're producing media and we're producing content that is relevant to the struggles of people around the world who are really trying to make change, and that is in fact durable. Because, I think our struggle has the ability to change many things culturally, including sometimes how the quote-unquote mainstream media reports things, and that's good. I'm all for them doing better. But as I said, I don't have a lot of expectations. So we're not looking at this as how do we find a way to influence the mainstream, but how do we actually find a way to replace them? How do we build durable, popular institutions that can survive attacks from any direction, that can continue to bring our voices to a higher level and to transmit our message in a way that can't be stopped? And so I think it's very much in the heart of so much of what we've said. And I think the ecosystem has been laid out here, and I know I see others in the audience. My guy Chuck Modi is here, who's doing great on social media. I believe The Final Call is here, and I want to give a shout out to my brother Richard Muhammad for always putting Palestine first and foremost. I see Liberation News is here. I see a bunch of people who are just yourself but are using your platform in huge ways to continue to promote that. Chris Smalls, I see, is here, by the way, who's one of those people. So many individuals, organizations, and institutions that have arisen over the, for many years, but especially since October 7th. I think we're very much on the right track. I personally feel tremendously hopeful about where the movement is for a lot of different reasons, but because we've been able to see so many different and creative and unique initiatives emerge in popular media and people's media that is opening a ton of doors, that's bringing people into the movement, and that really is laying the foundation for the liberation of Palestinian people, for the liberation of the people of the global south, for the liberation of the working classes all around the world from exploitation. Ultimately, Palestine will indeed free us all. Thank you so much.
Well, lucky for all of you, we still have this amazing lineup for another half hour. So we're going to do it's pretty great news. So I wanted to just ask one last question, general, to every speaker, and we can do the same order in answering it. Of course, all of us, the past 8 months, witnessing, reporting what's happening in Gaza, reporting on the genocide, reporting on resistance is an intense experience. But I wanted to ask each person to maybe share about a story which they have found particularly inspirational, because I think as people's media, yes, we have to cover our stories, but it's so we can inspire and move people. Ultimately, we want to bring more people in the struggle. We want to give them hope and confidence to continue. And so I think telling those stories, as Yumna talked about at the beginning, is so important. So hopefully each of you can share one of these stories of inspiration so we can all learn from it, feel that inspiration, and continue forward.
That is an incredibly tough act to follow. I was really looking forward to it just ending there, so we could end on that incredible note, and then you said we had more time. I'm a little nervous, but there's so many stories. I mean, we all know this, right? Every day, within, 5 minutes of scrolling on social media, you've been exposed to a dozen new stories that stick with you. And so it's really hard for me. I've been reporting in Palestine for so many years. There's so many names and faces that I remember. But if I had to think of one or highlight one story right now, I'd highlight the story actually of my colleague. So those of you who hopefully follow Mondawais, you've also hopefully been following the work of our colleague Tariq Hajjaj, who's our Gaza correspondent. Tariq, like all the other journalists in Gaza, was reporting on this genocide while also experiencing it simultaneously. And so since October, it's been this incredibly intense experience, for the people around Tariq, for us as his colleagues, to witness him go through this while also holding on to his intense desire to continue to tell stories and to share what he's hearing. And throughout this genocide, like so many other people, he's lost everything. He was displaced with his family, I think 5 times. His family's home in Gaza City was completely destroyed. And just recently, Tariq shared an incredibly devastating story on Mondawais, which I really encourage all of you to read, basically about how the war and how this genocide killed his mother. And even though his mother was not killed by Israeli bombs or by Israeli gunfire, she essentially was killed because of all the trauma that she was put through, the lack of access to medications, to proper medical care. And throughout all of this, he has shared his story. He has shared his family's story. He has spoken to people who witnessed the death march from the north to the south, people who experienced walking in this safe corridor, who were subject to extreme acts of abuse and torture and murder along the way. He spoke to people who survived the massacre at Al-Shifa Hospital. He's spoken to people who have survived the massacres at Nasser Hospital. And so to me, a story or a person really that I have continued to really hold on to as a source of inspiration has been my colleague. And to see that, we've all felt destitute and incredibly hopeless over the past few months. We'd be kidding ourselves, we'd be lying to ourselves if we said that we didn't all feel that at some point or every single day. But to see people like Tariq, who have experienced it firsthand, experienced unimaginable levels of pain and hardship, to still be determined with every fiber of their beings to tell their stories, to tell the stories of the people around them, and to bear witness to what is happening, and to force all of us to bear witness as well. So I wanted to, take this time to bring attention to him, to the incredible reporting that he's been doing, and to the incredible reporting of all the Palestinian journalists in Gaza. And so I want to continue to encourage all of us to uplift them, to uplift their voices, to read, of course, read their stories, share them widely, and to also draw inspiration from them. It can be incredibly disheartening to see when we're being challenged every single day by the mainstream media machine and this, war of information, as Mnar put it. It's this David and Goliath battle. And it can be incredibly disheartening to feel like you're up against the world every single day. But when you read these stories, when you see people that are determined to continue to share their stories, I think that's something that we can all draw inspiration from. Thank you.
It has truly been one of the most horrific past nearly 8 months that I have witnessed and experienced as a journalist who's been covering war since I was a child. I've been protesting war after war, US support for Israel, US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, the destruction of Libya and Syria. During that time, I also witnessed how the media played an integral role with the help of US intelligence agencies to foment sectarianism and division, much of which had influenced people within our anti-war movement. And all of that just went out the window with this genocide. Israel shot itself in the foot with this war by uniting people across all political backgrounds, bringing us all together from all walks of life. People you'd never think you'd even agree with are standing with us side by side, marching against this war, questioning why our tax money is funding this genocide. And that inspires me, because never have I seen such unity across political lines against US support for Israel. And when I look to Yemen, the poorest country in the Middle East, we need to just give a huge shout out to Yemen right now. I'm getting emotional talking about Yemen because I have covered Yemen for over a decade. While they endured one of the worst genocides, what we see happening in Gaza is horrific. But also Yemen has endured a starvation campaign where 23 million people have been starving because of the US Saudi-led coalition. Bombing and blockade, absolutely. And they are standing up for Palestine, risking their everything, showing the world what real courage is like. Every Friday, millions of Yemenis march the streets of Sana'a and say, "We don't care, bring the war here." And let's not forget all of the countries that have united to support Palestine, and all of the countries that have exposed themselves to be Zionist US imperialist puppets, supporting Israel and helping them circumvent the Yemeni Red Sea blockade. Shame on them. Shame on Saudi Arabia. Shame on Turkey. Shame on the UAE. Shame on all of the Gulf Arab states and Morocco and Egypt, who are undermining Palestinian resistance and our very humanity in our existence. Shame on you. But what gives me hope is the resilience of the global South countries, the countries that have been standing up to the US sanctions regime, the US war machine, economic warfare, and putting everything on the line, like Hugo Chavez did, to support Palestinian freedom. And I just want to end with how Israel really did shoot itself in the foot, because 5 years ago, we had a problem with sectarianism. And now Israel has brought people across all religious, political, every single line you can think of together to unite for the cause of Palestine. People now that you would have never even expected are seeing through the fog of war. They can see through the fog of war of the New York Times and all of the atrocity propaganda that has been pushed by these so-called legacy outlets. Shame on them, but you know what? This is the way forward. This movement, this inspiration, this raising of consciousness that we're seeing, this is what inspires me to continue to do what we do today, and we are only getting started.
Is this on? Okay. It is the 25th of May, which where I'm from in the south of Lebanon is يوم المقاومة والتحرير, which is, this marks the day that the Israeli military left the south after a brutal occupation, 22-year occupation in the year 2000. And I just want to, I guess, use this little space of time to commemorate that moment. And in Wawag, one of the figures that we've done a lot of political education around is Sohab Shara. We've done put out some materials about her and screened her documentary. And she was an incredible revolutionary who, at the age of 20, attempted to assassinate Antoine Lahad, who was the head of the South Lebanese army, this like auxiliary force that was basically administering the Israelis' occupation of Junub, of the south. And she was imprisoned in Khiyam. And for those of you who don't know Khiyam, I really want you to know about Khiyam. It is this prison in the town of Khiyam in South Lebanon. And there's a reason why I'm talking about this right now with relation to Gaza. It was a brutal prison, and the people in it were subjected to horrific torture. Soha was in solitary for years, and it was basically a black site. Like they wouldn't let any humanitarian, no one was ever allowed in there to see the way they electrocuted people. And so when liberation came, actually at that point, Soha she was no longer in Khiyam. She had just been released, actually. But there's some footage that circulates every 25th of May in the south of Lebanon, which is basically of the Israeli military and the SLA, like they left in the middle of the night and they basically fled. And then the next day, like when people realized what had happened, they headed straight for the prison. People came from all over the south to this prison to bust down the doors with their hands, and like you see in the footage, it's incredible. It's like probably the most moving thing of them just like literally hitting the doors and kicking the doors down. And at first, like the incarcerated people, they don't know what's happening. Like you see in their faces, they're confused, and then it turns into awe. Like you just see them realize, like you see liberation set into their faces. And I watch this footage now, and I know this is what's coming for Gaza. Like I know this is what's coming for Palestine. And we know that liberation is near because we have tasted it before, and we know that we will taste it again, and that this border will get torn out of the earth, and that we will all be free.
Yeah, it's tough because how do you boil it down to just one thing? I mean, it's the level of inspirational stories. I guess if I had to pick something, I would pick maybe the several things we've been able to do on the role, existence, and the struggle of Palestinian political prisoners. And I also want to offer my thanks in that we've been able to interview Basil Faraj, quite a bit. And we are here in the Walid Daqqa room, and I hope people have the opportunity to go see our interview with Basil, whose father is also a political prisoner. He gave a beautiful tribute to Walid Daqqa that I think everyone should see as a person, as a struggler, as an artist, as a writer. It was just a very important thing. The ability to even show the short clips of people being released in the political prisoner exchanges in the first round around, the student organizers, the others coming out with just such an incredible energy of willingness to continue to fight and continue to struggle. I mean, it's immensely inspirational because this is an absolute torture regime. I mean, if you see the people have probably seen them all the time, but the photos they often do of people when they went into prison and when they come out, and it's just undeniable that it's just constant torture every day. But in the midst of that, the unbelievable sense of steadfastness, of struggle, of development, of ideas. I mean, so many things that are happening. Of course, I think many of us have been reading the book Trinity of Fundamentals, and to even hear, please. And if you don't know the book, you need to go buy the book like right away. Like use your last, however much it costs, and buy the book. I'm telling you, there's a saying in the MST in Brazil, the landless workers movement, that political education is more important than eating. And if you read Trinity of Fundamentals, I think you'll understand to some degree the importance and the power of that. But the fact that this is not only the story of the struggle of someone who was imprisoned, but even the story of smuggling the story itself out of prison, and the immense amount of logistics that went into that to maintain the historical memory of the importance of the legacy and the struggles of those who have come before to inspire those who will move forward and continue to fight is just totally, totally immense. And I think we've seen historically, from Nelson Mandela to Bobby Sands, the struggle of political prisoners is the vanguard of national liberation struggles. And to have the opportunity to just show even a little small window to the world of what is happening there, to have the opportunity to engage with the families of political prisoners who are just so gratefully and graciously giving us their time is not only inspirational, but I really feel humbled to have that opportunity. And I think it's important that we just continue to lift up the Palestinian political prisoners, to demand that they all be released, to push back against this ridiculous propaganda. They are not terrorists, they are freedom fighters, and that has to be continually underlined.
Thank you all so much for those reflections. As journalists, we have a great responsibility, a responsibility to the 45,000 martyrs, to the 144 Gazan journalists who were also martyred, and to advancing our struggle against Zionism and imperialism for the liberation of all peoples of the world. We need to continue building and strengthening our people's media outlets, to continue inspiring and giving hope and confidence to our movements, and to show the world and the ruling class that united, we will be victorious and Palestine will be free. I'm so sorry. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending this session. You can't leave the room until you open your phone. Lift up your phone, everyone. Open up your preferred social media app of choice or website, however. Search Mint Press News, search Mondo Weiss, search People's Dispatch, search WAWOG, NPYM if you haven't already. Search Breakthrough News, follow them, check their pages every day, send stories that you want to be covered, because when we say people's media, we mean people's media. We're media for the people. So that's what we're here for. So do all that. I know it takes a minute. There are 5 of these outlets, no worries. But thank you all so much for joining us today. I also forgot to introduce myself. I'm Zoe Alexandra. I'm the editor of People's Dispatch. It was an honor to be here. It was an honor to be here, and look forward to sharing with everyone for the rest of the conference.